Well now, that's an interesting bit of history. The only problem is, what age is that? I mean, was this Iron Age? Bronze Age? Yep, it can all get a bit confusing. Okay, so let's kick off with the Stone Age. So the Stone Age is split into three separate ages. There's the Palaeolithic, the Mesolithic, and the Neolithic. And the Palaeolithic is the oldest of these, and the Palaeolithic goes back to, it's a period that goes back to 3.3 million years. But in Britain, we have evidence of occupation dating back to 814,000 years. So you could say that the Palaeolithic for Britain started 814,000 years ago and then ran up to 9,000 BC. Now, this period is also known as the Old Stone Age and is the time of the hunter-gatherer. And so they lived in small groups, and for the most part, they lived in caves. So this is where the true caveman comes from, or the true idea of the caveman comes from. And the tools they used were really very crude. Just things roughly hewn out of rock. Things such as hand axes and scrapers and choppers. And they were just really very crude tools. Now, one thing we see during the Paleolithic era is the way they dealt with their dead, and quite often we see the dead being left in caves, but there's one thing that we do see quite a lot of, and that's the use of red ochre. And the bodies seem to have been painted with this red ochre. For what reason, we're not sure, but this seems to be prevalent right throughout Europe and in Britain. And we have one burial in the south of Wales, down on the Gower Peninsula, a cave burial, and that is the burial of what we now know as the Red Lady of Paviland. And this one dates back to somewhere between 25 and 30,000 years ago. It seems likely that this red ochre had some sort of spiritual or religious significance. So that's the Old Stone Age for you. Next on the list is the Mesolithic. And the Mesolithic in Britain dates from 9,000 BC through to 4,300 BC. And again, this was distinguished by the hunter-gatherer groups. Their tools had become a little more refined, but the groups they were in were less tightly defined small bands of groups, and they were becoming a little more organised. And in some places they had temporary settlements, so they were still hunter-gatherers, they were still following the herds, but now they were showing signs of organisation and domestication. So they weren't farmers really at this point in time, but they were starting to domesticate animals And this was reflected in the tools that they made. And we can now see some compound tools where we have axe heads actually on shafts, and they used deer antlers, and also there was more widespread usage of the bow and arrow. And we started to see a shift from single burials in caves to more communal burials and cemeteries. And although the burials were now out in cemeteries and in the open air, there's one thing that still seemed to persist, and that was the use of red ochre. And it seems that they buried their dead with grave goods. They buried them with tools and food and jewellery. So quite clearly they were being prepared for an afterlife. And now we move on to the Neolithic. And the Neolithic started in 4,300 BC and stretched right through to 2,200 BC. And this is the era of all the big stone monoliths that we see, Stonehenge and the portal dolmens and the long barrows, and it's also the age of farming. So it's still the Stone Age, and we still have all these stone tools. The only thing is now is that they've taken to polishing some of them. And so the tools now have become even more sophisticated and even more refined. And also, the kind of tools they were now manufacturing, they were changed. They were now manufacturing tools for use in farming. And we start to see primitive sickles and ploughs and even harpoons for spearing fish. But the major change here in the Neolithic, and the change that really defines the Neolithic, is the movement from hunter-gatherer to farmer. So man was now domesticating the wildlife and creating their own herds, and he was starting to grow crops and cereals. And so now he had settled down and he was starting to live in communities. And he was also starting to build these huge megalithic monuments, these monuments where they would worship the ancestors and have these big ceremonies and rituals in order to bury their dead. But these megaliths were more than just monuments and memorials to the ancestors. They were also calendars, and the positions of the summer and winter solstice played a very significant part. So why was the sun so important? Well, remember, these guys had just become farmers, and knowing the seasons, when to plant the crops, when they needed to prepare their herds for the cold winter, these were all very important things to these people now. So places like Stonehenge, no doubt extremely important throughout the whole of Britain. It was a place of celebration, and people would come from all over the country down to celebrate at Stonehenge. And it was at a specific time. So yes, it was at a specific time they would come down for these celebrations. And that time was the time of the winter solstice. So the start of the days getting longer and the rebirth of the sun god. But it wasn't just these stone rings that they built. They also built the long barrows and the passage graves and the portal dolmens at this point in time too. And the long barrows and passage graves, they all show signs of religious significance. So the Neolithic, farming, ancestor worship, and big huge rave parties in honour of the sun god. So next in Britain, between 2200 and 750 BC, we see the arrival of a new group of people migrating from Central Europe. And with them, they bring a new technology, the technology of smelting metal. And so now we have the arrival of the Bronze Age. So this migration into Britain was from a group of people that we now call the Beaker people. And they call the Beaker people because it seems that they had a habit of burying their dead with a beaker. But they weren't just buried with a beaker. They were buried with other grave goods as well. It's just that this bell beaker shape was quite prevalent in all their burials. And the burials that are associated with the Beaker people are called the round barrows. Now the round barrows you'll find often marked on the maps as tumuli, and they are the big mounds that you find out in the countryside. And there are many different types of round barrows you'll find throughout Britain associated with the Bronze and the Iron Age. And I did a video on that a little while back, and I'll put a link to it up here and also in the description. So with the migration of the Beaker people into Britain, the question is often asked whether or not this was a cultural migration or whether it was actually an invasion. What happened to the existing Neolithic people that were here in Britain at the time? Recent studies involving DNA samples tells us of a 90% displacement of the Neolithic peoples in Britain during that time. So whether it was an invasion or not, the result remains the same. The indigenous population was pretty much wiped out. So now in 750 BC, there was some even newer techniques in regards to smelting metal. And they were brought to Britain from people migrating from southern Europe. And this saw in a new age, that of the Iron Age. And so the Iron Age was a period between 750 BC and 43 AD. And so along with the importation of this new metal smelting technique, this new metal they called iron, came a new group of people, and those people we now know as the Celts. Now, before we go too much further, I should stress that this idea of a Celtic race, well, that's not quite true. It was always a Celtic culture. And so these people that migrated into Britain and we don't even know whether or not it was a huge migration or whether or not it was just a small migration bringing the Celtic culture, the workmanship and the way of life with them. We do know, however, that between the period of 200 BC and 50 BC, there was a large displacement due to the expansion of the Roman Empire of a tribe known as the Belgae. And it was these guys that settled in the south and southeast of Britain. And there was also another Gaulish tribe that suddenly appeared right up in the northeast of England, and that was the Parisii. What's important here, though, is that by 750 BC, the Iron Age had come to Britain, and soon to follow was the Celtic culture, and soon Britain was populated by tribes that were fairly well indistinguishable from any other Celtic group of tribes. Now, in 43 AD, we see the Roman Emperor Claudius embark on his conquest of Britain. Mind, he had another mate of his have a go a little earlier. A guy by the name of Julius Caesar. He had a crack at it between 55 and 54 BC. However, it's 43 AD that we see the conquest of Britain by Claudius, and so this leads on to what we now call the Roman era. And it was from 43 AD to 410 AD that Britain was under the rule of the Roman Empire. And although there were long, hard battles here to start with the Romans trying to conquer the Celtic tribes, they did eventually overcome most resistance, and seeing as they were here for over 300 years, the latter part of their rule saw a new term being applied to the British, that of the Romano-Briton. Celtic culture, however, was still quite prevalent, because that was one thing about the Romans. When they came to conquer, they didn't wipe out your spiritual and religious beliefs. They adopted them into theirs. And so what we saw was a lot of syncretization between the Celtic gods and the Roman gods. And syncretization just means that they tried to unite the Celtic gods with the Roman gods. So we ended up with gods such as Sulis Minerva and Mars Bellaticadras, Apollo Granus. And so it seems, at least in the latter part of the Roman era, that Britain had quite happily and readily accepted Roman culture. In 410, we saw the Romans leave Britain once and for all. Now, it seems they had their own problems, and the Roman Empire, well, people just didn't seem to respect it the way they once used to. And the Goths were knocking at the door, and so the Romans eventually withdrew from Britain and took their forces back down to Rome to fend off these other arrogant invaders. And yes, I do have another video for that too, and it's called Why the Romans Left Britain, and you can watch it by clicking on the link up there, or better still, wait till the end of this video and look in the description down below, and I'll put a link down there. And so this now brings us to the last period I want to talk about, and that's the period between 410 and 1066, otherwise known as the early medieval period, and some people refer to it as the Dark Ages. So, from around 440 AD, we started to see some incursions from some foreigners from Europe, and they were the Saxons, the Angles and the Saxons, and they started with some raids on southern Britain. By 500 AD, they had created a number of settlements on the southeast coast of Britain. And so from that point on, we started to see a series of battles between the native Britons and the new invading Angles and Saxons. And with that, so comes the start of a new country, that of Angleland, and soon one that was to become known as that of England. So now, the Angles and Saxons barely had time to get themselves settled. In fact, only 200 years, and along comes another load of invading marauders, the Vikings. And these guys were a nasty piece of work. I mean, constant rape and pillaging. These Saxons must be thinking, I don't know why we bothered in the first place. We should have left all this up to the Britons, and they can deal with all these damn Vikings. So now, who was Angle, who was Saxon, who was Celtic, who was Viking? The whole thing started to get a little bit grey. Everybody was fighting everyone. And if all that wasn't bad enough, up pops another little character called William of Normandy. Or some people call him William the Conqueror, others called him William the Bastard. And in 1066, he led his Norman troops across the Channel to face King Harold, the Saxon king, in battle. The result was the end of the Saxon kings in Britain, and a new ruler and a new type of rule under the Normans. And so those are the ages and periods of Britain leading right up through to 1066 under Norman invasions. And I'm going to leave you now with a little summary I'm going to put up on screen. And I'd like to ask that if you've enjoyed today's episode, then give us a thumbs up. And if you're not a subscriber, then consider subscribing to the channel for more content just like this. And with that, I'll see you again very soon.